Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are joined today by Ian Proud, a former British diplomat who spent between 2014 and 19 at the British Embassy in Moscow. But the topic today is the Iran war, the American objectives, but also the consequences of this war. So, welcome back to the program, Ian.
It's very nice to see you again, and yeah, great to meet you in person in Tbilisi a couple of weeks ago as well. That was nice too.
Yeah, very much so. Well, regarding Iran, though, what I found very remarkable was how the objectives on the American side shifted a lot throughout the week. That is, initially they weren't supposed to be part of the war, then they were part of the war. It was supposed to be about the nuclear program, then it was regime change. They were against ceasefire, then they were pushing for ceasefire. Uh, how do you read this situation? Is this competing interest within the US? Is it accommodating the different voices, or is it simply the United States changing its policies based on what can be achieved? As initially, this was a lot of enthusiasm about success, and then it looked more concerns, perhaps, that this is something that a war which they were losing. How well? What lessons have you drawn from this war?
Well, one of the key lessons, which kind of solidifies what I've been thinking for a while, is that Trump has a very short attention span, and he doesn't really have a grand strategy in mind. There are no big strategic objectives for the US, in this. Trump is driven by knee-jerk reactions, as has been the case in the US strikes on Iran. They were coaxed into doing something by a massively powerful Israel lobby, in the US, following Israel's attack on Iran, in the first place. Maybe Trump thought he could draw a line under it by having a short, sharp sort of military strike, against Iran. That's precipitated some kind of a ceasefire that we see, placed now, but it's not really clear what the long-term plan is. What doesn't appear to be the case is that actually the US has obliterated, as Trump said at the time, Iran's nuclear sort of research kind of capabilities. Many people now concerned that this is only going to accelerate Iran's search for a bomb. So if the plan was to kind of end Iran's nuclear program, it doesn't really appear to have done that. If anything, it will have had the opposite effect. And this all comes back to, as I said, Trump is being driven very much by kind of short-termism and the need to kind of please and feed the Israel lobby, back in the US. But the other thing that I find interesting about this, of course, is that actually nobody's talking about Gaza anymore. Ever since Israel launched its attack on Iran, the attention has wholesale moved away from people, children, and innocent civilians being starved to death in Gaza. And if there's been any success from the Israel side of this campaign, then it's that people are no longer talking about Gaza.
Uh, do you see, well, given that the shift from the beginning towards the end in terms of the optimism, because in the beginning we had this big shock and awe. The Israelis were able to bring down Iran's air defenses for a few hours. There seemed to have been the assumption that there would be a paralysis. Everything would break down in Iran, stop working. You might have a collapse similar to what happened in Syria. And regime change. So the idea that Iran was this, paper tiger that could be knocked over. And so while Iran might have been underestimated, it also appears that Israel was overestimated in terms of the power of this Iron Dome, which has been talked up for so long time. But was this a miscalculation based on bad intelligence or ignoring the intelligence? How did it go so wrong?
There's always an optimism bias whenever any of these military strikes are conducted. You see some very quick early victories, and people see that as a sign that actually there's been a bigger success. But if you look back at all the kind of in recent history, examples where NATO or its kind of proxies have undertaken military activity, they've all delivered a quick kind of military success, but ended up in a longer term chaotic mire that they've had to exit from at a later stage in a worse position than when they started. So Afghanistan is a very good example of that, where the Taliban were very quickly kind of defeated back in 2003, but nevertheless, the NATO power stayed there for another kind of 18 years, almost 20 years, and had to withdraw with the Taliban still in control. In Libya in 2011, Gaddafi was quickly deposed, and now this horrible civil war has continued ever since that time. The Iraq War in 2003 as well. Saddam Hussein was quickly, deposed, but then the Americans got locked into this dreadful kind of internecine conflict, which gave birth eventually to ISIS. So what's different, I think, about Iran is that some of those same conditions don't necessarily apply. There isn't an internal kind of civil war in place, which did erupt in Iraq, which obviously did happen in Libya and was ongoing in any case in Afghanistan. And if you compare it with kind of Syria, where all those conditions also applied, getting internal kind of a civil war, multiple, international actors, it took, even under those circumstances, 12 years to deliver regime change in Syria. It's absolutely not clear that, regime change is possible or likely anytime soon in Iran, because the circumstances are materially different. What appears to be happening now is that actually, you know, Israel's attacks kind of bolstered by, the Americans is only going to hardening Iranian resolve, not to be conquered.
And but in terms of the actual strikes that took place, there's been a lot of discussions around the extent to which they were successful. It was political theater, but both of them, the strikes on Iran, there's many argue that it was a complete failure. That is, they hit nothing as it had been emptied away, and also this bunker buster wouldn't necessarily work this way through a huge mountain. And then the same applies for the retaliatory strikes by Iran, that they were hitting largely empty American bases in Qatar, which was also symbolic in order to retaliate, but then not undermine the ability to pursue a ceasefire thereafter, again, to retaliate without escalating. How do you assess these strikes? Because there's obviously a lack of evidence provided, but how do you assess this?
Yeah.
Do you think they were both more symbolic in nature, or?
I do. I think, certainly the US strikes and the retaliatory Iranian strike, if it can even be called that, were both heavily choreographed. Trump had been talking about possibly kind of striking Iran for over a week, 2 weeks, possibly, before it actually happened. That allowed time for the Iranians to kind of move any sensitive equipment that they may have, which actually, reporting now appears to suggest that is what indeed has happened. This leaked intelligence reporting from the US side has indicated that actually the US strikes have actually had fairly minimal effect on Iran's nuclear program, and the Iranian strikes in response, were also choreographed. We're hearing about it from the BBC before the actual missiles were in the air. The base had been evacuated beforehand, but the target was in the desert, a long way from civilian areas, in Qatar, that could be caught by collateral damage if, as missiles kind of, were shot down. Both appear to have been sort of highly choreographed strikes. But I mean, the question for me is actually what this will mean for the public mood in Iran, even if these attacks were very choreographed. I mean, I think for ordinary Iranian people, they will see the world's biggest military superpower launching these, incredible kind of weapons, on their soil, using stealth bombers that no other country in the world, can afford. And I think many will feel that actually they're under attack by the biggest kind of global superpower, and actually this is deeply, unjust, and it will strengthen their resolve to support the Iranian authorities, quite frankly. So, I mean, the choreography bit appears to be irrelevant to actually what this means for, the public mood, in Iran itself. And I think clearly people are hoping that actually this will foment some sort of unrest, which leads to the ushering in of a new Shah, sort of, sort of Shah's son, or, waiting in the wings to come in to reintroduce, and royal kind of autocracy. But I mean, there's very little evidence that there's any mood at all for that to happen.
Yeah, this is looks like another consequences from, but it should have been predictable. But I think this is part of the wishful thinking, the idea that if the government is or regime, as we say, is on its back foot, and it would be, popular forces would rise up, the bombing of U.S. and Israel would be, more or less greeted with flowers, similar to what was assumed in Iraq, and the return of the Shah, all of this. All of these assumptions. I think all proved wrong. It seems as if the Iranian government has strengthened itself, given that you had this reflex that people, came together against an external aggressor, which is something that the government has benefited from. But also internationally, Iran has strengthened its position over, I would say, over the past 2 years as well. A lot of people around the region are quite upset about what's been done to Gaza, and it seems as if Iran and Yemen have been more or less the only ones. Well, you can put Lebanon in there as well. The only ones who stood up for the Palestinians, while their own governments ignored it. And now, of course, Israel attacks Iran. Iran not only fight backs, but then it's interpreted by many as Israel and the United States having to stand down and accept a peace, given the power of Iran. This is it looks as if Iran will come out of this a lot more strengthened, both domestically and on the international stage. Shouldn't this have been predicted, or at least calculated as a risk?
Yeah, again, it goes back to the optimism bias. We feel that actually kind of the weight of economics and military might are on our side and will prevail in the end. Even though there's been no point since about 1978 where that's appeared even remotely likely in Iran itself. So there's a lot of, as you say, wishful thinking. If you read the Western mainstream media, they're already talking about how the demand for regime change is kind of growing in Iran on the back of this latest kind of very theatrical kind of tit for tat between the US, and the Iranians. I think actually the biggest step for Iran over the past kind of year was joining BRICS, and what that means actually for Iran's future within this kind of what some people call the global majority, in alignment with the Indians, the Chinese, the Russians, the developing world kind of, writ large. There's a sense that Iran is trying to kind of normalize itself within that kind of global community that's kind of moving away from the global hegemon of the US and getting much more multipolar. I mean, I think that ultimately will decide Iran's fate in the future. But nevertheless, the Western kind of passion for regime change goes on unabated. I don't really know what explains it. If it's not in Iran, it's in other countries like sort of, Georgia, for example, or it's in Romania, or if it's now in Hungary, anywhere where you find governments that actually stand up to sort of Western progressive liberalism, there are attempts underway to actually unseat the governments in those countries, which is a deeply kind of troubling, a sign of the times that we live in today.
Well, you mentioned also before that Iran might have been more reason now to pursue a nuclear weapon, or at least suggesting that the that there will be more pressure for this. But what does this mean, you think, for the non-proliferation treaty, because, and also the IAEA, because we now see that the Iranian parliament has voted to, they decided to cut relations with the IAEA. They said they need to ensure the security of their nuclear facilities before, at least they can allow the IAEA, which are seen as leaking information. But how is arms control in any nuclear agreements gonna look like going into the future now? Well, one can add a further element that it seems as if Trump's argument now that they've destroyed the Iranian nuclear program, and anyone who says anything differently, Trump has said they're undermining. It's an effort to undermine him. So, but if there is no nuclear program anymore, there's no Iranian, and nothing left. Didn't Trump just also eliminate his reason for having arms control, for attacking Iran? I mean, it's yeah, how can we start to discuss this now when neither the Americans or the Iranians seem to have anything they're willing to talk to the opponent about?
Yeah, is exactly right. And it's the point I've made before that if they really have destroyed the nuclear program, then why need to keep sort of backing Iran into a corner, promoting regime change and actually allowing the Israelis free reign to undertake sort of strikes against Iran? It's, it's quite right. I mean, Iran is a signatory to the NPT in Israel. It's not, we have to take it as a worrying sign if Iran wants to back out of the IAEA. I mean, thankfully, no country has used nuclear weapons since, World War II. I mean, I think no country should develop nuclear weapons. But, seen from the Iranian point of view, if they're being subject to these unprovoked attacks from US-sponsored, Israel, then you can understand why, like North Korea, they may feel that it's in their interest for defensive purposes to kind of pursue this capability, even though they've always denied that they are, pursuing that sort of capability. So, I mean, Trump, it goes back to my point at the start about Trump's short-termism. Actually, during his first term and during this term, he's spoken about having a much bigger non-proliferation grand bargain with Russia and China. Nothing's really happening, around that, and that conversation appears to have gone largely off the table. So, I want us to get back to that bigger conversation about how to, have proper arms control, in around the world at a time when many of the instruments of that from the sort of 20th century have largely been dismantled.
Well, how about the relationship between the United States and Israel? This is often the focus of academics, journalists. Well, it's very difficult to even criticize Israel in the United States without facing repercussions. It seems almost obligatory for politicians to announce their, undying support for Israel. However, some of the rhetoric from Trump of the past 2 days, is very angry with Israel because they tried to undermine his ceasefire. Again, Trump can change his mind again tomorrow, and but it seemed to have opened up the door for many others, also on the political right, who are now being very critical of Israel, arguing, their interest is not the same as ours. Do you see something, a larger trend here? The America and Israel splitting, not a divorce, of course, but at least some sunlight coming in between them.
I don't think so, really. I mean, Trump often has these splenetic pronouncements about sort of Putin and Zelensky, on Ukraine. Well, the indications are that actually the US and the Russians are slowly starting a much bigger kind of reset of their, relations. I mean, that's just in the nature of Trump's style. I think the circumstances which make me believe that the Israel relationship is as strong as ever is, one, the strength of the Israel lobby in the US, of course. Two, the kind of Islamophobic kind of bent of the US, obviously exacerbated, since 9/11. And three, and which is the most bizarre and baffling, is this kind of religious kind of cultural dynamic to this, where increasing numbers of people in the MAGA movement are saying that we can't be Christian unless you love Israel, which is bonkers. Given that actually, if you read the Bible, there's actually the Israelites that actually led Jesus Christ to his death. So I mean that's the whole kind of dimension that, frankly, is very specific to the American kind of cultural context, but appears to be kind of woven through the mainstream of sort of MAGA politicians, illustrated most starkly by Tucker Carlson's interview with Ted Cruz, recently.
Yeah, this he seemed to have well, Ted Cruz interpreted was it from Genesis that quote a bit creatively in terms of linking it to the state of Israel. Yeah, but it is a good point on that. Another consequence is dividing lines now within America First, because people like Tucker Carlson, who's been the leading supporters of Trump, came out and criticized this, and instead of accommodating this criticism, Trump effectively lashed out at anyone who criticized him. And I think some arguments from the MAGA camp was Trump is the leader of America First, so he gets to decide what America First means. This is seems like it can have permanent damage for the whole movement which he started, or do you think it's just
Yeah, I
superficial?
think so. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think because of the essential vanity and narcissism that drives Trump's actions, he sees that he is totally indispensable to MAGA movement, and the MAGA movement is in fact kind of Donald Trump, and that without Donald Trump, it can no longer kind of sustain itself. But I'm not really sure that's true. I mean, I think he's tapped into a very rich vein of political kind of discourse, in the US, the unheard kind of ordinary kind of working people in the Rust Belt America who felt left behind by the progressive liberalism of like the Democrats, and that sort of thing. Several administrations during the early part of the 21st, century. So he's undoubtedly kind of tapped into that seam in a hugely kind of profitable way. But I think his mistake is in believing that actually he is completely indispensable to the MAGA movement. I don't think that he is. I think actually there's a risk that with his increasingly kind of unpredictable actions, some people start to wonder whether he's a liability to the MAGA movement, much like people eventually realized that having dementia wasn't a good look for Joe Biden as president of the US. I mean, whether they realize too late is another matter. But I wonder whether the cracks we're starting to see now are a sign that actually a 79-year-old kind of president who acts in increasingly erratic ways and wants to centralize power upon himself may not actually be a good idea for longer term, sort of strength of the movement.
Well, another topic or consequence of this war, though, is probably the relationship with Russia. Again, another one of America's war now. Well, despite what Trump says, this is also his war. Uh, how do you think this will affect Russia in terms of, I guess, a trust in U.S. diplomacy or concerns about deception? Do you think it's going to be more superficial?
I mean, I think Russians want to see a reset in Russia-US relations. I don't think they want to see that at the complete expense of their relations with China or other countries in the developing world. But I do think it's important to them to have that reset. If you look at any of the posts that people like Kirill Dmitriev make on X, then they're very much kind of trying to be on side with what the Americans, are doing, not in the horrible and gauche and embarrassing and fawning and sycophantic way of Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of the, NATO, but nevertheless, cautiously kind of encouraging close cooperation. But nevertheless, the Russians still speak out when they don't agree with US actions, as they have on Iran. So Russia is still maintaining its foreign policy independence, being able to actually criticize the US, which I think is an entirely healthy thing, quite frankly. But so I think actually, Putin is going to play the Iran thing quite cautiously. He wants to kind of have more strategic kind of partnership with Iran, particularly on the issue of energy, with like a corridor sort of going south, through Iran for the shipping of oil and gas and that sort of stuff. Putin right now puts far more eggs in the kind of the BRICS basket than the US reset basket, but nevertheless, I think it's still important to Russia.
Well, I guess my last question would be: do you see this war as being done with? If well, the ceasefire, how stable is this? And also in the more medium term or to long term, if the war was ended because it wasn't going well, do you think the US will have another go at it in the future with Israel, or more in
Yeah.
the short term, the ceasefire falling apart?
Well, it's hard to call it a war because the states are not contiguous. Israel and Iran are some distance apart geographically. If you look on the maps, there's been exchange of aerial kind of strikes. Iran is a tiny global military power conventionally compared to the US. There's no strategic benefit to the US in having a war with Iran. It's hard to imagine a conventional war between Iran and Israel anyway, because of the geographical separation between them and the desire of the kind of largely Sunni kind of Gulf Arab states not to want to kind of get involved in that sort of anyway. So, there's no real kind of plan or purpose for this beyond, very deep-seated kind of Iranian and Israel animosity towards each other that can only be resolved through diplomatic processes, which people would be running away from at every possible opportunity. So, I mean, there's just no plan. There's no real benefit to kind of what the US thinks it's trying to do in Iran right now, if it even does much thinking at all, quite frankly.
Well, thank you for your views here. This, I keep making the point, this is one of the strangest wars I've at least seen in my lifetime, how quickly it came, the escalations, the shift in priorities, and I'm still trying to map out the possible long-term consequences. So thanks again.
Cheers, Glenn. Always nice to talk to you.